We are finally going to ELBAF. Prepare yourselves for a grand adventure on what surely has to be the single biggest island in the entire world, but not before we wrap up the events of Egghead Island, which has been my favorite weekly reading experience since I caught up to the series in 2000, and I won't mention the exact year. It's very low, and don't want to mention it because I'm very old. But before getting to that, we need to start with this cover story, because it is heartwarmingly simple, and I think a lot of its meaning will get lost amongst the craziness of the rest of the chapter. But essentially, Denjiro's solution to the problem with all of the kids hating all of the Yamatos is to sit them down and eat a delicious pot of Odin, which is beyond perfect. Our first introduction to Kozuki Odin was a man eating a pot of Odin on the charred remains of another man named Katsuzo, which is one of the more shocking introductions in One Piece, but Odin was doing this as their way of sharing one last meal and drink together, and thus honoring his relationship with Katsuzo. And obviously, Odin's story is then bookended by him being boiled in a giant pot of oil, something he agreed to in order to keep his vassals safe and ensure that Wano would one day be free. On Wano, Odin is the meal of friendship. In the same sort of way that around the rest of the world, sake is the drink of fellowship. Luffy, Sabo, and Ace used sake to become brothers, and now Denjiro is using Odin to slowly and deliciously bridge the gap between the people of Wano and the child of Kaido. And also, to Yamato's credit, this is a very solid step in following in the footsteps of Odin, because he was the one who started using the meal for this purpose. If indeed Yamato still wants to do that, it's a bit unclear exactly where the whole wanting to be Odin thing is right now, but if we are following in the Odin story, then Yamato's probably gonna have a big, and I mean like mountain pig scale problem to solve very soon. But heading into the actual chapter and picking up right where we left off, Joy Boy's haki has done even more of the damage than previously suspected, because now it looks like even vice admirals are falling victim as the result of this mighty knot. And this does make me wonder about haki in general, because it's very, conveniently affected all of the Marines, but none of the Giants or the Straw Hats. All the people we don't like, they're down. All the people we do like, still standing. And if it's knocking out Vice Admirals, then it really should be taking out a fair few allies as well, if not most of them. And usually I would say that haki is somewhat controllable by the user. Shanks and Silver's Ray Lee have both shown us that haki can be used very precisely, even on a wide scale. But in this case, there was no one actually there to control the haki. So I guess Joy Boy was just on a whole different level, able to pre-program some sort of future ally insulation. And we do see Dory say that this haki might be even greater than that of the Shanks, which isn't surprising because Joy Boy did claim that this was the greatest haki, but it does seriously hype up Shanks even more. To think that he can even be compared to this level, which is a display of power that we haven't even come close to seeing from Luffy yet. So contrary to Luffy's words, on Wano, we're not quite at the peak yet. Of anything, really. I mean, if you're Dragon, then we're not even thinking about the peak. We still need to get him off the easterly facing toilet and into base camp. Very disappointing for a One Piece dragon. One Piece is full of dragons. Fat ones, drunk ones, pink ones, more pink ones, literal ones, non-canon literal ones, and also the disappointingly fatherly ones, to name but a few. And with all of these dragons, you could practically craft your own dragon empire. I mean, if we didn't already have a better way of doing that, with Dragon City, where you can hatch and evolve over 1,000 unique dragons to raise for your own personal fight battling purposes. By building your hatchlings a thriving city and giving them jobs to pay their dragon bills, by having them engage in PvP battles, with victories, ever so many victories, earning you the right to call yourself the best dragon person in the world, which shouldn't be too much of a problem, because there's only 450 million installs of Dragon City so far, and look, I believe in you. You can do this. Don't let all of your former and highly embarrassing failures cloud your dragon-based judgment. And you can do it by downloading Dragon City by clicking the link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen, and by doing so, you'll be given a special bundle with 15,000 food, 30,000 gold, and the very rare Iceling Dragon to get you started. So good luck on your journey to glory. But for now, it's back to you, me. But Egghead is all but over now, we're sailing away. But I think it's very fitting that this arc ended with a flashback of events that occurred long before this arc even began. Because time has been one of the most enduring themes of Egghead. The whole idea of we land on a future island and yet we focus almost completely on the past. In fact, the past is what we're actively striving for going forward. So it's very fitting that our final moments here are once again exploring the past and how it connects to all of the events we've just read. It's like a microscopic examination of One Piece as a whole. We start this grand adventure adventure plowing forward into the future, and it's eventually going to end by taking us right back to the past. And I'll have a lot more to say about that shortly, because I actually think that this whole 2-week void is a very small-scale reenactment of the Void Century and gives us a lot of clues as to what happened. But first, during this flashback, our trio of Sherlocks discover that, gasp, there is a traitor. And I'm a bit surprised that they instantly jumped to accusing Lilith because, yeah, sure, aspect of evil and everything. But in my opinion, both violence and greed shouldn't have been quite off the table. But I think that Lilith not being the culprit actually contributed to Vegapunk's viewpoints during his message, where he refused to take a stance on who is good and who is evil in this enduring historical conflict, because he had just had a situation where he made that judgment and he was wrong. The evil Vegapunk that he thought was most likely to betray him was actually one of the most loyal. So this whole good and evil business is not as simple as it seems. And this is especially poignant because Lilith is the innate evil that exists within Vegapunk himself. So if Vegapunk can't even make the correct value judgment on himself, then what right does he have to declare with any certainty who the good and evil entities are in this conflict? Especially because, again, it's just not that simple. Yes, the world government, pretty bad, but not all of the world government, some pretty good. You do have this next generation of Kobe-esque Marines, and even that legendary generation of Garp, and with that in mind, it might not be the best idea to point a finger in the general direction of the world government and turn the entire planet against everyone in the organization, because they need to play out their roles unhindered every bit as much as Luffy does. But I do still think it's rather unbecoming of the smartest man in the world to not at any stage even consider the thought that, what if the greedy person is being real greedy? Or what if the violent person is working with the world government to enact more amazing violence? But in the end, Vegapunk did everything he could to preserve Lilith's life. And in fact, he has now trusted the future of his dream, and likely the future of the world, to the aspect of evil. So again, he is in no position to be making flat judgments about good and evil. Dr. First Name Unknown Vegapunk is a complex figure, and I think that his words and motivations are going to be studied incredibly thoroughly by fictional pirate scholars right up until the final chapter of the series and probably beyond. But just for right now, in 2024, let's get things straight here. Vegapunk knew that he was going to die, but then he wiped his memories and he didn't know that he was going to die. But then he found a message from himself that said, mate, you should strongly consider dying. And then another thing happened. This time, one thing that the smartest man in the world could not predict, which was the Straw Hat showing up on Egghead Island. So I wonder if there was ever a point where Vegapunk felt maybe just a tiny jolt of hope. And I wonder what would have happened if the world government had been even slightly delayed and the Straw Hats were allowed to escape. Would Vegapunk still have stayed behind and died like he told himself to? I'm not so sure, but maybe. And a pretty surprisingly integral character in this chapter, and in fact this arc, turned out to be Sanji, who is the only Straw Hat that Vegapunk confided his death wish in. Which, if I was Sanji, I would take as a pretty high compliment. Vegapunk sees Sanji and he goes, he's an odd fellow, but he seems a good ham. And also he's strong, too strong. He's so strong, he's probably going to end up saving my life, and I need to tell him in advance to do not that. And I guess in a way this kind of absolves Sanji, because he was copping a lot of flack for letting Vegapunk die, which he didn't do, but usually if someone was in this situation, they'd go on to blame themselves for not being as strong, fast, smart, or even a good cook enough to save the person who was just killed. But as much as he's struggling with it, I do think that Sanji accepts that this was all part of the plan, and there was really nothing he could have done to stop it. But that moment at the end of the chapter is everything. I love that Vegapunk confided in Sanji that he hopes that the Straw Hats will be the ones to claim the One Piece. Because that's a side of Vegapunk that the world didn't get to see in his message, which was mostly filled with a very objective scientist presenting the facts and not coming to any conclusions unless the evidence was 100p certain. Because in addition to time, the other key motif on Egghead Island has been that of faith. And there's been a lot of really interesting moments of science and faith being integrated. We have quite a literal example of that in probably the most pious man in the One Piece world being turned into a super futuristic cyborgo. And I would like to believe that Kuma's faith was passed on to Vegapunk. And that led Vegapunk to seeing something beyond science that many years later would result in him placing his full faith in Luffy. Because you got to ask the question, why Luffy? Vegapunk doesn't have the luxury of knowing that he's the main character. And there's really no objective evidence that he's the right person for the job. All Luffy is one big vibe check. Sure, he evokes the imagery of the sun god Nika, but that is not science. That is art, and art is painfully fickle. And even when the Straw Hats arrived on Egghead Island, Vegapunk saw this as an act of fate, a greater force intervening. And again, this is also something that Sanji is now reckoning with on a much smaller scale, not quite certain of what he did, but also unable to deny its results. And you know, the way I describe this is a sense of unclear justice, because it's not just Sanji who's leaving Egghead conflicted. I have to say that this chapter does recontextualize justifies Kizaru's actions, whether he carried them out purely on behalf of the world government or because he somehow understood Vegapunk's final desire, doesn't really matter which one it is, kind of irrelevant, because that lack of clarity did end up producing justice this day, which is Kizaru's whole thing, unclear justice. And as always, this may, and it's probably just me coping in regards to my favorite sparkling Admiral Man, but he may not be as irredeemable as initially thought. After seeing him kill Vegapunk, his story has been framed as one of tragic obedience. But what if the real story is one of tragic disobedience? Dying is what Vegapunk, well, I mean, want might be a strong word, but it's what he needed to do. And so I think it's actually very depressingly fitting that he did so via the hand of an old friend, a helping hand perhaps. Kizaru definitely didn't want to kill Vegapunk. His current anguish on the floor tells us that much. And actually, you know what? Was Kizaru knocked out by Joy Boy's haki as well? It's hard to tell because he was already on the floor and lost his will to live prior to all of that happening. But is there perhaps, teeny tiny slight chance that Kizaru knew that Vegapunk's end goal was to die? And what he was actually fighting against internally was the desire to spare his friend's life. But instead, he ultimately chose to facilitate the last wish of Vegapunk. Again, this is probably mostly cope, but it would be a very One Piece thing to do. To present us with a horrific action, bad man, bad, and then emotionally justify it, give us a reason for it, and make us go, oh, good man, good. Again, it would definitely fit Kizaru's motto of unclear justice, because in his own way, he did stumble onto an act of justice through a very unclear and unconventional path, and right now, Kizaru is probably lying on the floor, still not quite sure about what he's done, but still somehow knowing that it was the thing that needed to be done, no matter what path it took to get there. Or not, maybe he's just a broken cog of middle management existing in a depressingly outdated system. Switching gears now, it's definitely not lost on me that Vegapunk's 2-week void is a small-scale metaphor for the much larger void century, especially with the message he left himself. Because Vegapunk waking up to find that is very much like the Roger Pirate stumbling on Laugh Tale, seeing the message from Joy Boy, and knowing exactly what to do from there. They didn't live through the void century, so they obviously have no memory of it, but they trusted what they discovered. Especially when it came to Roger, there was this definite sense of trusting in the power of death, which is why Roger then went on to make sure it happened in the most spectacular way possible. And that's exactly what Vegapunk did as well. He decided to trust what he found, and then he enacted the single most world-changing 10 minutes since Roger's execution. Consider it like this. If Roger was the person to kickstart the race for the One Piece, then Vegapunk is the person signaling the race's end. We're here now. Someone's gonna get it ridiculously soon, so prepare for changes. And I can't help but wonder if Vegapunk's words here reflect the Void Century as well. The fact that he used the incoming disaster to assure his victory. He knew that he was going to die, so he used that fact to do infinitely more damage to the world government than he ever could have done with the remainder of his life. And maybe Joy Boy was in a similar, albeit much more grand scenario, where he saw that their efforts were going to fail. It was a 100% guarantee. The Ancient Kingdom was going to be defeated, and so he switched focus to setting up a series of events that would culminate in their eventual victory that could only be triggered by his death. Or even a huge crack theory that Joy Boy's intention was to erase history for a period, much like Vegapunk did, although I think that idea might be going a bit too far, but maybe. I do like the idea that Joy Boy has already prepared for whatever is going to destroy the world government, and whoever finds the One Piece just needs to believe in that. The full story, it's not important, just do the thing. Which I think is a perfect answer for someone like Luffy. Obviously, we as readers, we demand to know as much about Joy Boy in the Void Century as possible, but Luffy has never really been the type to care about people's history. He doesn't care for the full story. He cares about right here and now, and he makes a personality judgment, then puts 100% trust in his choice. Which is why he walked away from Nojiko when she was explaining Nami's backstory. Luffy didn't need to know. There is nothing that Nojiko could have told him that would change his mind, and honestly, nothing she could have told him that he didn't already know intuitively. So I can very much see Luffy being told exactly what to do by the lingering will of Joy Boy, and he goes, yeah, that sounds like a nice guy, I'ma do it. But now, we've known that this has been coming for a while, but it still feels so surreal at the moment, because we are probably a mere handful of chapters away from finally landing on ELBAF. Other than Laugh Tale itself, this is the single most hyped up island and arc in the series, and my hopes for Usopp are pretty damn high, given that he had one of the final lines of the chapter. And it's a pretty big deal, because usually in this situation, it is Luffy who proudly declares that they are setting sail to X destination. You know, with the classic captain's yell, and then in the anime it'll do something like pan up to the sky. But in his current wrinkly pruny state, Usopp was the one who had to give that classic destination yell. And now I know that I had some, I suppose, misguided hopes for Egghead Island being Frankie's arc, or not his arc, but at least make him a big part of it, given how at home a cyborg engineer engineer should feel on a future island. I'm going to take the L there, obviously, and we're going to deal with the consequences of the Frankie Bingo in a future video, don't you worry. But I think Oda is making it clear that ELBAF is going to be a big deal for Usopp. And look, I don't know, just throwing this out there, it could very well be the case that Usopp goes on to become the first Straw Hat to achieve his dream. That he does something worthy of being accepted within the Island of Warriors, and thus becomes a brave warrior himself. And I also have to mention that seeing him reunite with Dory and Broggy was even better than when Luffy re-encountered them. But also Chopper. I think I've mentioned this before, but Chopper has never met Dory or Broggy, which is really trippy because their arcs are back to back. And so I often associate all of Alabasta together as one big ball. But obviously, we're probably not heading to ELBAF straight away. In fact, we're probably on track to begin my favorite kind of One Piece chapters, which are the in-between global catch-up chapters. I say probably on track because we do currently know where most of the world stands. Egghead has done such a perfect job of casting a very wide story net. But the sort of thing I'm now expecting to see are major players across the planet doing exactly what Shanks did at the end of Wano and declaring that it's now time for them to go after the One Piece. And thanks so much again to Dragon City for sponsoring this video. Definitely check them out through the link in the description or the QR code on screen. And by doing so, you'll be given a special bundle with 15,000 food, 30,000 gold, and the very rare Iceling Dragon to get you started and embark on your journey to dragon some glory.